Your destination is on the left.
In October 2021, Leslie Bain, the Executive Director of the Donkey Sanctuary of Canada, welcomed me to the farm for a tour. I was on a quest to locate any evidence of the original log cabin where my Stewart ancestors once lived before their stone farmhouse was built. Census records confirm that the Stewart family were still living in the log cabin as late as 1861. Sometime after that, Peter Stewart built the stone farmhouse that still sits on the property to this day. Rumor had it that there might be evidence of the former log cabin in the woods to the east of the existing property. I wasn't sure if or how the property boundaries may have shifted over the years. It's possible these rumored cabin ruins may have originally been on the Stewart farm. Could they be the Stewart's original log cabin? As Leslie and I approached the present-day eastern boundary of the property, we observed the remnant of an old stone boundary wall, similar to those constructed by farmers back in Scotland when they had to clear stones off their fields in order to cultivate the land. Construction of the stone wall was likely begun by Peter's older brother, Robert Stewart, in the late 1830s and completed by Peter himself after he took over the farm in 1848. The stone wall runs right alongside the existing fence line, indicating that the eastern boundary of the property has not changed since the Stewarts first cleared this land. If there are any ruins of an old pioneer log cabin in the woods beyond, then we can now say definitively that those ruins are not the Stewart's log cabin, and they would have belonged to their next door neighbor, Alex McLennan. Leslie showed me the location of the original well and barn, not far from the existing stone farmhouse. It seems most likely that the original log cabin would have been sited close to the well and barn. We identified two open, flat locations, one elevated and the other not, that would have been adequate for the location of a log home. However, both of these locations are in areas that have been redeveloped probably multiple times over the years. So any evidence of a location of a former log cabin has likely been erased a long time ago. Without the expertise of an archaeologist and a formal dig, we're not likely going to locate the exact location of the original cabin. And that's not something that can really be justified just to satisfy my curiosity. So now we know that there is no trace of the original log cabin, but the stone farmhouse that Peter Stewart built still remains. So walk back in time with me now as we explore the early history of the farm property that is now the Donkey Sanctuary of Canada, located just southwest of the city of Guelph, Ontario. The farm was originally owned by a family named Stewart from the southern highlands of Perthshire, Scotland. The best known member of this family was Peter Stewart, who built the stone farmhouse. But before the Stewarts arrived in Puslinch, this land belonged to the Attawandaron First Nation. The early white French explorers called them the Neutral Nation because they remained neutral between the Huron and Iroquois peoples. Europeans began encroaching on this land in the early 1600s. Our trickle became a flood of immigration after the American Revolution in 1776. By the early 1800s, the nearby towns of Guelph, Hamilton, Cambridge, and Galt were already established, and European immigrant farmers were moving in en masse to gobble up the land and establish pioneer settler farms. Our Stewart ancestors were among them. Peter Stewart and his 10 siblings were born in a Clachan settlement in the Highlands of Perthshire, Scotland, called Morel. which is located in Easter Glentarkin on the shore of Lough Erne. It was a community of impoverished flax weavers, barely eking out a living in houses built of stones with thatched roofs. Most of the inhabitants, including our Stewarts, were fluently bilingual. Gaelic was their native language, spoken in the home, but the government schools forced them to learn English, which aided them in doing business with lowlanders to the south. This is the actual house that Peter and his 10 siblings were born in. This is Morel. In the early 1800s, during a time known as the clearances, absentee landlords in Scotland were expelling Highlanders from the homes that their families had occupied for hundreds of years. Politics and economics had rendered the longtime tenant farmers an inconvenience to their landlords. The Highlands were cleansed of Gaelic-speaking inhabitants. In Morel, the Stewart's landlord raised the rent until the families could no longer afford to stay there and they were forced to leave. Peter Stewart's father died around 1830, and about 3 years later, his widowed mother, Catherine, and her children, along with a handful of grandchildren, made the difficult decision to leave the only home they had known for generations, to move halfway around the world to an unknown land called Upper Canada. They spent 8 weeks in the windowless hold of a wooden ship with little food and lots of sickness. One of Peter's brothers-in-law contracted cholera and died during the voyage. After arriving in Montreal, they lost all their possessions at the bottom of a river when their barge struck a rock. They eventually arrived in Hamilton with little more than the clothes on their backs, where they were promptly quarantined for several months because of the cholera case. They presented themselves at the estate home of a wealthy and powerful distant relative whose family came from a property called Dundurn in Scotland, just 2 kilometers from Morel, namely Sir Allan MacNab, future Premier of the United Provinces of Upper and Lower Canada. Peter Stewart's grandmother was a MacNab. In Hamilton, the family divided into 2 clusters. The older siblings remained in Hamilton, initially in a home provided by Sir Allan MacNab, while the younger siblings and their widowed mother acquired these 100 acres of land in Puslinch. Peter's older brother, Robert, then just 20 years old, became the head of the Stewart household. Peter was only 13 when they arrived in Puslinch. There were no roads in 1834 back then. They followed a blazed path through the unbroken forest to arrive in Puslinch. Their land was still uncleared rough forest. They were true pioneer settlers. Their first winter was spent in little more than a shack. Peter Stewart's childhood memory described it as a shanty without any door but an old country blanket hung over. Bears, wolves, and rattlesnakes were common hazards. As someone who has lived through many southern Ontario winters, I can only imagine what it must have been like. Those Highlanders were a hardy people. Robert Stewart married his neighbor, Mary Gillespie, and they had 4 children together. And in 1848, tragedy struck in the form of a smallpox outbreak in the community, killing Robert Stewart, his wife, and his widowed mother, and leaving their 4 children orphaned between the ages of 2 and 12. Peter Stewart and his older sister Catherine, now ages 28 and 32, stepped in to raise the orphans. One of those orphans, Hugh Stewart, was my great-great-grandfather. His daughter, Jean Stewart, later married Tom Brown, the chief of police in Hamilton. A brief journal entry from Peter Stewart tells stories of fighting off bears with a fire poker and getting oxen drunk on whiskey to make them pull harder while removing tree stumps. Peter supplemented his farming income as a road builder and as a whiskey runner. Peter waited until he was 46 years old, until after Robert's orphans were adults, before finally marrying Catherine McLean. She was only 23 years old, exactly half his age. They had 9 children together. Tragically, Peter's wife died shortly after the birth of their last child. And again, Peter's sister, Catherine Stewart, stepped in to help raise another brother's children. In 1877, Peter's next-door neighbor, Patrick McGinnis, fell upon hard times after his father died and had his farm foreclosed on. The farm went up for auction and Peter Stewart purchased it, thereby doubling his land holdings. However, Patrick McGinnis was not happy about losing his farm, and later that night he set Peter Stewart's barn on fire, killing all his animals and destroying all his farm equipment. He was convicted of arson and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Peter served as an elder at nearby Duff's Presbyterian Church for 27 years. He also ran the local Sabbath school for many years, and he was remembered as an esteemed and generous man. But the real unsung hero of this story was Peter's older sister, Catherine Stewart. She must have been a remarkable woman. She never married nor had any children of her own. As a teenager, she helped her widowed mother raise her younger siblings in a foreign land. Then she raised the 4 orphaned children of one brother and the 9 half-orphaned children of another brother. She was in her 60s when her last nephew was born. Peter and his sister Catherine remained on the farm until they died in 1901 and 1904, respectively. The farm then passed to Peter's son, Neil Stewart, and later to Neil's son, Donald McLean Stewart. It was in the Stewart family for 4 generations. And today, it is the donkey sanctuary of Canada.